Remember, speak into the microphone. Good evening. Welcome. We will begin tonight with an opening prayer from President Mike Gazdik of our host, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Thank you. Before I offer a prayer, I'd just like to welcome everyone here to our church. It's good to see you. It's hard to believe another year has gone by. I mentioned that to Bob when I walked in, and it just, boy, before we know it, we'll be here next year doing the same thing. So once again, welcome. It's great to have you here with us. And I'll offer an opening prayer at this time. Our Father in heaven, as we gather this evening for this event together, we're grateful for the opportunity that we have to be here together as friends, and for the opportunity we have to discuss the matters that we will this evening. We're grateful to live in a country that allows us the freedoms and opportunity to worship as we so desire, and we pray that we will be able to continue to have those freedoms available to us. We pray for the many inhabitants of this earth that find themselves in difficult and unfavorable circumstances, those in war-torn countries and those who are suffering from famine and other hardships. We ask that thy blessings would be with them, and ask that thy blessings be with those who have the ability to help them, that they might do so. We're grateful once again for the opportunity to be here and express our gratitude for the Holy Scriptures and for the other wonderful things on this earth that we have to be able to understand more about Thee and Thy love for us. And we say these things and offer these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you. Introducing the others in tonight's panel, next to President Gazdik is Reverend Paula Vukmanic, St. Francis Episcopal Church. And then Reverend Gathje. Gathje? Yeah. You like the broad A. All right. I should remember by now, but I don't. St. Paul's Lutheran Church, and Rabbi Briskin, Temple Bethel. I'm Bob Rothman, and we can't pass up Rabbi Briskin without wishing him well, as this is his last time on a Dawn panel. He's moving this summer to the Philadelphia suburbs, taking a pulpit there. So we want to wish him well, and what happens, and send an argument this way every once in a while.
Thank you.
Okay. Tonight's subject, the responsibilities of a religious leader. We ask a lot of our religious leaders. I started listing a few in my own mind as I was thinking about tonight. For our clergy, we have pastor, we have teacher, we have ritual leader, we have administrator in many ways of what's going on, and general leadership, people we turn to when we need a friend. And it's a very high calling, and I have highest respect, as I'm sure you all do too, for the people who do this work. One of the things that I see, and the panel's welcome to tell me they don't see it that way, but which they've never been bashful about. But I see an overall, in my lifetime, decline in the ethics of public figures. Who do you look up to anymore? Where's Walter Cronkite when you need him, or Harry Truman, or somebody that can lead and inspire and serve as a model of morality and integrity? And let me ask, with the national figures in politics, sports, entertainment, wherever you want to go, it's hard to find people that you really admire and can serve as role models to your congregants. How do you deal with this? Chuck, you go ahead. You go first, since it's your last time.
One of the things that I think we've seen too often more recently is that those to whom we look up end up failing us. And whether it is a public figure, whether it is a journalist or an athlete or a politician, too often, it's better. In recent years, it's even been clergy. Sometimes, I mean, for me, a lot of the people that I look up to are those who have long since passed, but whose words still live on in the page. And maybe that's a safer bet. I'm not exactly sure. But I think that, I hope that everyone, especially young people, can find those to whom they can look up. Teachers, clergy, people that they know that they can be in relationship with. To me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be have this kind of admiration for some figure that they would never know or could never meet, because chances are, especially in this internet age, in this age of technology, that person will probably at some point do something that disappoints them. Think about it. Who was the most popular and revered figure in the 1980s and early 90s? Who was America's dad? Bill Cosby. Okay? Right? And now we see where he is. So for me, when I look to the people that I look up, the people whom I admire, I still always go back to Abraham Joshua Heschel, died in 1973, left an extraordinary legacy of theology and activism, and I have not heard a bad word said about him since he passed away.
I want to give an example of something that I was taught by an experience I had. When I was in my 20s, I was studying art with someone who had his own studio school off of Wilshire in Los Angeles. I had been at the Otis Art Institute, and through there I found this teacher, 76 years old, teaching 20 hours a week, teaching academic art, which I was not able to learn at the Otis Art Institute. So I quit the Otis Art Institute and began studying with Theodore Lukatz, 20 hours a week with about a dozen other people my age, for 4 years, week after week after week. And I had him on the highest pedestal. I wanted to be just like him. I wanted to absorb everything he was teaching me. And then I came to a point with realizing inside of myself, it's time for me to move on. I need to find my own voice. Because at that point I could tell, I admired him so much, I did not know what to say for myself. So sometimes we can project onto other people, and all of a sudden we've lost our voice. We've lost our own integrity, our own wisdom. We leave it to other people to be wise or to be clever, and we'll follow them. But yet each of us is called with our own voice, our own wisdom, and we need to speak truth to power, truth to friends, truth to family. And that's where I'm trying to focus, and that's what I'm trying to share in my congregation.
John, Mike, do you get, I'm curious, do children come to you with the problem of recognizing the faults of famous people and asking what they should do, how they should manage that in their own mind?
No. And I was trying to figure out what the next step in that response was going to be after I say no. And I wonder if this is some part of me that recoils a little bit at the question. I'll just name this here. Being the token Gen Xer of this table. Do you still count?
Technically, I believe I
He's in.
Yeah.
He's in. Okay, well, I'm on the other. We're close.
Close, very close.
So it's
Not.
okay. So I say that with the gentlest nature that I can say that. It seems to me that as I look through the past, there's always been the mentality of the sky is falling, that there's always been the idea that, oh boy, if we could just get back to 30 years ago when morality was right. You hit well with Bill Cosby, and who knows what Walter Cronkite was doing in 1958. Oh, but if we could just get back to the 30s, that would be our heyday. Back when we could do things really, really well, when everything was good with the world. So I find myself just struggling a little bit trying to answer the question about what it means to be in this particular immoral world that we're in, as though it's any less or more fallen than it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. And I guess my personal story, I remember hearing about my great-grandma, whom I loved dearly, and still do to this day. She's been gone now for almost 25 years. It was an incredibly brutal blow when I found out that she once got in some pretty significant legal trouble because she refused to rent out her extra room to a black man. That was tough, sort of seeing the shine get wiped off a little bit, and realizing that, yes, all of us have a little bit of that fallen in us, and all of us have to cope with that in our mentors, in those we look up to, that we all have those things there.
Sure. Thank you for all that great feedback. Bob, let me bring this back just a little bit to kind of the context of our theme tonight, the responsibility of religious leaders. And I would maybe suggest or even submit that one of our responsibilities is to try to be one of those people that maybe you described at the start, Bob. Where did those people go? Hopefully, as religious leaders, we can be those types of people that can uphold those values that people can look to. To be kind of open and honest, it's something that's very challenging for me as a religious leader, because I know that I am by far I'm far from being perfect. And we know that none of us are perfect. We have a little bit of the fallen in us. And I struggle sometimes I struggle sometimes, or I'm leery to make sure that I don't profess that everything that I teach or preach about, that I'm 100% following, but at the same time, I think there's a strong responsibility there for religious leaders to try to be the best and represent what they're talking about and teaching about and testifying about. So that's a thought that I had on that.
Well, I guess as the senior member sitting up here, it seems more real to me that we have declined in morality, because I can remember times that were not so messy. Anyway.
What, like the late 70s during the disco era? I mean, because the one thing I would press back, I think that this perception, as John was saying, is that we live in a different. I think that all times there's been this great source of immorality. I think that the difference right now is that because of cable TV and just the proliferation of things that are available through video and movies and whatnot, and because of social media and the internet, I think that the things that were maybe a little bit more hidden are now much more revealed. And so I think the perception of a less moral time is there. Whether it's actually, I think you'd have to do some real serious academic study to say, is it really less moral now than it is? I understand that perception. I think that, to me, it feels like, what my kids have to deal with. I have almost 14-year-old, and I think what he's dealing with right now as a 14-year-old seems to be very different than when I was 14 years old. But I imagine that when I was 14, my parents were saying, boy, what he's dealing with as a 14-year-old was so different than what I was. But probably the similar themes across the ages, I would imagine.
Well, let me give you some examples. Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy were all reported to have affairs on the side, but it was never reported as such until later after their death and in history books. It was kept quiet. So maybe the leadership, maybe their morals weren't so great, but the standards of the public were such that you just didn't report those kinds of things. All right.
So, is it better if we just keep those a secret? I mean, FDR and JFK, a little bit of philandering there, but boy, they were upstanding people when they were alive. We found it after they were dead and gone, but we could look up to them when we needed them during the big war and during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So is it better, or are you suggesting that it's better if we don't sort of dredge up those things?
Wouldn't knowledge of that philandering affect the way you look up to those people during those times? Back then, now people separate out these things very clearly, but I don't think back then that they did.
I wasn't there.
That's one of the problems with having a lot of gray hair. You remember when the price of gas was 20 cents a gallon.
So, Bob, as I'm listening to you, I know much of me can go ahead and just say, and I recognize, okay, I'm sitting here, what can I offer as a religious leader with what you've described? And I know for myself, when something hits the fan before a Sunday morning, whether it's news that shocks and disappoints, or news that sickens my stomach because of gun violence, and maybe I've already prepared a sermon and now I need to alter it because, okay, God, what do you want me to say to your people? How do we honor our reality and face our reality and not lose heart? How do we speak when a moment is very difficult to address? Because in any congregation, there are people on both sides. Republicans, Democrats, independents, pro, against, whatever the topic. And I find preaching an event and very scary because the moment has come, I need to step into the pulpit. I've prepared something, it's the best I can do. But one of the things I'm consistent about with my congregation is that we are in this together. And when one suffers, we all suffer. When one rejoices, we all rejoice. And there are times in this last year where we have as a country really suffered. And we need together go forward and try to discern answers. And sometimes I feel helpless. And yet I need to show up on a Sunday morning. And so I say to God, okay, I'm showing up, give me the words, help me to be for you what you need me to be, help me to be the best that I can be, and then I have to let go and let God. And I'm sorry I don't have the answers, and I'm sorry when I feel helpless, but I know we feel that way sometimes, and It's very hard to be a religious leader in moments when you don't have answers. I hope I am a person of hope. I hope the light of my truth shines, that someone is not discouraged, but along with me believes there is a way forward, and I will not give up.
Well, you mentioned gun violence. Let's take that as an example. The issue needs leadership. It needs somebody and some group or something that can speak and be respected. You have politicians don't count, and they're not respected. I'm not sure where anyone would look for leadership other than to the clergy. And this is a big role to play, and I'm not sure how you put this thing, something, we all say something needs to be done. And then we look to say, all right, what's going to be done and who's going to lead and where's it going, is this going to be a fragmented local kind of thing or a national thing? But I think we've given up hope on politicians actually getting in and being constructive here. Chuck, you went through a lot of planning and discussions about gun violence after Vegas. Where does that stand?
You want to? I mean, Reverend Paula and I, we were partners with a number of other clergy in this. So, do you want to begin to speak to it, or I'm happy to share a little bit? I mean,
When the Vegas shooting happened, I guess it was a few days later, that we had our monthly interfaith clergy lunch at St. Luke's, Rolling Hills. And I remember that day the clergy saying, thoughts and prayers, yes, but action, absolutely. And from that group, about 6 of us helped organize a panel at St. Francis that how do we find common ground against gun violence? How do we find common ground to promote gun safety? And we had a panel of 2 women who were, they had both lost sons through gun violence, murdered. And it was the Brady campaign. They were from the Brady campaign. We had a councilman and we had a police officer. The police officer was from Palos Verdes Estates. The people who attended were from all walks of life, from all of our congregations, and it was a meeting that gave us a chance to be together, to talk about how we felt, and to begin to generate ways to go forward, just to go forward together. And talking about options was one of the things that emerged that night.
and I think one of the more instructive lessons from that night was when some members of my congregation were at a table with a gun enthusiast, a guy who I think owned something like 60 firearms. And my folks, like, they could never comprehend, like, why would anyone need 60 firearms? And they had this conversation with him in which they got to better understand his love of collecting, his love of the weapon, the different things. They might not have agreed with it, and they might have thought it was, you know, who needs 60, but at least they were able to sit at the same table and have a respectful conversation, even though they came from different perspectives for this. So one of the things that, you know, we're working on now, it was, I think that we fell into that trap. There was a meme going around Facebook about, you know, sort of outraged thoughts and prayers, and then ends up being crickets chirping until the next act of gun violence happens. And I think that, you know, we kind of fell victim to that, and so now we have mobilized again, and we're trying to figure out the next response. But I think that one of the responsibilities as a religious leader is to address these episodes, these moments of tragedy and crisis in our country from a way that does, yes, elevate and lift up thoughts and prayers, because, you know what, I think the 4 of us are probably pretty good at doing thoughts and prayers. But it can't stop there. So whether it's, you know, gun violence, whether it's issues related to immigrant justice and providing providing protections for dreamers, or whether it's any host of issues, at least ones that are near and dear to me and to my Reformed Jewish movement. That's part of our role, is to bring people together, to discuss, to educate, when appropriate, get those together to advocate as well. It's all part of it's part of what we do.
You know, with the specific to the gun violence, one thought that I've had since some of these incidents have happened and are transpired, unfortunately, has really focused, and this is more towards an action towards this, but I've thought a lot about families. And we know that families are the basic unit of society. And not just gun violence, but some of those other things that have been mentioned, I think spur or come from families that are not functioning well, or individuals who don't even have families. And it seems like one of the things as a religious leader that we can do as we try to address these issues is try to, I think, strengthen families. And if we have families that are gospel-centered and operating like they should, it seems to me that two things will happen. One, some of these problems will be eliminated, and two, we'll have more help, more action to reach out towards other people that potentially need that. So as a religious leader, that's kind of a thought that I've had, is I've thought, okay, what can we do? And how can we do that? So.
This group, that myth that you're talking about, where is it now, or what's the projection? What are you trying to accomplish?
After Parkland, we gathered again. We kind of had our moment of tshuva. It's a Jewish response to kind of admitting our failure, because we had failed to follow up with the promise that we had made. And now we are coming back together and trying to work together to come and create a series of educational forums over the course of the next year that will help to bring people together on a regular basis. That's not just always in response, but ends up being a little bit proactive. And we're going to see where it goes. I mean, we don't, we wish that we clergy could be the solution to epidemics of gun violence and helping to increase gun safety. But we know that we can't do it alone, but we can bring a moral voice to it. We can be conveners of community. We're probably more able to connect people of differing viewpoints and perspectives to come together and talk about it, to have sacred conversation about it in ways that can't necessarily happen at rallies where everyone is really kind of formed their bunkers for whichever side they're on. I know for me personally, I've had a lot of great education from members of my community who are gun owners and gun enthusiasts who, are sharing stories with me about, why they own guns and what type of weapons that they own and why they have them. And we have sane, thoughtful, reasonable conversations. And we can listen to each other. That doesn't happen in a lot of areas outside, at least, of our congregations in the public sphere.
Do you see linkages with other groups? Do you see fellow clergy from within California, within other states, that are proposing a link-up of some kind that would generate some momentum here? Or is it local? Is it entirely local? Yeah.
I know in the Episcopal Church, our presiding bishop has published eloquent letters to inspire us and to help move congregations and dioceses, but I'm not aware of, oh yes, there's a place I can go. There I can join more clergy to make my voice multiplied. That I'm actually, Bob, not aware of. But I do know that, Chuck, you hit it on the head. I too felt failure when Parkland happened, and we said to each other, now what do we do? And see, the problem for all of us is we're sometimes so busy with what right is in front of us that the bigger picture stays bigger. And I know for myself, after this extraordinary event of the interfaith panel and all that came to St. Francis in November, well, after November it was Thanksgiving, then we had to get ready for Christmas, and we had Advent this, and we had these programs, and then Christmas came, and I had 2 big memorials and a wedding, and you see what I mean? I was caught up with necessary ministry moments with people right in front of me, and I had the bigger picture, but it wasn't close enough to my heart to move me to do more than I did. And so when Parkland happened, I said, oh no, and we're trying again.
And I love this conversation and the humility that both of you have shown, because it sort of goes back to the question Bob asked first. Well, can clergy be those moral voices, those leaders to stand in for all of those other groups that no longer stand up as leaders for us? And I love this conversation, again, because of that humility and that reminder that we too are a part of the mess, that we too are a part of the issue, because we can get the blinders on, because there is a sermon that happens every Sunday. Sunday is going to show up, whether there's another shooting or not, and whether any of us would probably like it or not, that sermon is going to take the priority. The preparation for that sermon is going to take the priority. If you have a funeral service for a member in your congregation, that's going to take the priority, and that's not good or bad, just again an example of the state that we're all in, that we would love to be able to do more, to say more, to feel more, to speak more, to be more. But we're still in this old world, in these old bodies, trying to do that work.
Is there you don't want to speak straight politics from the pulpit, but you want to speak ethics and morality. And sometimes the line can be hard to draw, and you have to determine where that line should be. And I'm interested in how each of you manage that decision.
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. And I think as religious leaders, I think we have probably the responsibility to teach correct principles and ultimately allow people to govern themselves to a certain degree. But to the extent possible, I think that certainly we have the responsibility, whether we're whatever set of scriptures we're using, to be able to represent that and certainly teach people from a principle perspective right and wrong. I think that's probably pretty easy. Now, how people respond to that and what type of action they take, that's certainly, we have free agency, people have free agency and will respond accordingly. But I think, at least from my perspective, Bob, that's something that is not too hard to do and something that we certainly should do, I think.
Anybody else? So you have to have some guiding principles that tell you where to go and how far to go with it, recognizing that your congregants represent a spectrum of political thought.
In the Episcopal Church, we're part of a worldwide lectionary, so I don't choose which readings I'm preaching on for a particular Sunday. And so I listen and delve into the scripture that I've been given, and what is God saying to God's people? What's the message that I'm feeling inspired My bottom line is I absolutely believe in the power of love. That God is doing more than we could ask for or imagine. And I believe in the ripple effect, no matter how small or how large. I delight in letting someone go in front of me in the line at Sprouts who has only one thing and my basket is full. It happened last Saturday, and then I turned around and the person behind me, she too only had one item. I said, well, why don't you go in front of me also? Well, you can't keep letting people be in front of you. And I said, oh, yes, I can. I know that's a silly example, but it's a ripple effect of grace that we can be a part of. But Bob, you ask a very precise question, you know, how far can we go from the pulpit? And I'm afraid I don't go as far probably as I could, because I know there are people on both sides. So I try to go to the heart of the matter. Where can someone, no matter what side they're on, find a truth they can live with, a truth that supports the power of love, of honesty, of wisdom, of grace? And I try to preach to it in an ethical way. I try to foster honesty, no matter what political persuasion or the issue. And one thing I have developed, because so many things had happened the last few years with different types of gun violent moments in our society, I decided just to do a generic thing to cover that, because so many people are always suffering. So every Sunday, our congregation hears the following. We pray for those killed or injured from acts of terrorism, gun violence, abuse of any kind, from the consequences of hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, floods, and other natural disasters, and for those who grieve for them. Guide us along pathways of safety. God of mercy, make us new. That covers everything I can think of with people who are suffering every day. And I don't mean to make it generic, but I'm trying to also help us remember all of these people.
Let me ask a more specific question. Do you make a distinction between what you say on the pulpit and what you say off the pulpit, what you say at home? Do you feel that I was talking to a friend who would never say anything political on the pulpit, but he says, I have a family that lives in my house, and we have, during election time, we have posters out front. Because he says, there are other people in this household. So that's his approach to it. But I'm wondering how you manage this distinction. Do you make a distinction?
I manage it poorly. That's how I manage it, poorly. And I imagine probably I might speak for others and not just myself when I say that is a very tough distinction. And there are a number of hats that a pastor or a priest or a rabbi have to wear. And one of those is the hat of the preacher. So what I say from the pulpit, I speak it in a way that is not how I would speak with my friends, because that's just not the hat that I'm wearing at that particular time. It doesn't mean that I believe something different or I'm lying from the pulpit in any way or lying to my friends. It's just that there's a different sort of space for different types of conversations. So what I believe about politics, generally speaking, I don't think the folks in my congregation would struggle to sort of discern my thoughts from my sermons. For good and for ill. They know what they got when they called me, and if they didn't, they know now. But there are a number of places where I can speak in different ways. So my Facebook is a place where I'll speak differently than I will from the pulpit. When I'm at a protest, my actions and my language will look different than when I'm posting on Facebook or when I'm talking in the congregation at a meeting. I will say that in almost all of those occasions, I do go knowing that I go as a representative not just of myself, but also a representative of the church, of the particular church of which, to which I've been called, but also to the larger Lutheran church to which I belong, to the larger Christian church, to the field of clergy. And so I regularly, when I participate in other activities or when I'm speaking about particular things, I always have that part of my mind on. So it might be when I'm at protests, I will wear this outfit because I think it's an important statement to make that I come not just as a me, but also as a me who is a pastor. When I post on Facebook, my friends know exactly what I do, and there are times when I do have to sort of step back and say that is not what I want to project, but I suppose, long story short, we just have many hats that we're asked to wear, and we take them on and put them off, take them off and put them on at different times. For myself, I sometimes take them off and put them on at the wrong times, but I'm still new to this game, so I'm learning.
Go ahead. Oh, please. We all serve congregations on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. It's not exactly Berkeley. So yes, we have to be careful. So if we are particularly liberal or progressive, we know that if we speak and preach a highly politically charged, partisan sermon from the pulpit on a Friday night or Shabbat morning or Sunday morning, that we're going to have half the congregation saying, "Preach, brother," and the other half the people saying, "Don't renew his contract." So we have to, and many of us have to walk that fine line. Now, there are certainly congregations out there where there is a more kind of monolithic political belief, and it's probably a lot easier to speak a very progressive message or very conservative message and know you're not going to alienate folks. I like to say that I don't preach politics from the bema. I preach values. I look at the word of my text, of my tradition. And when my text shares the story of Abraham leaving his home to wander to a new place, to cross borders without walls and to settle into a land that was not his, it's an immigrant story. When I read the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery and trafficked and detained in prison unjustly, that's a story about trafficking and mass incarceration, or maybe not mass, but so it is easy on certain issues to be able to connect the tradition and the word with what's happening in our community today. As John was saying, my Facebook posts, I don't have a Rabbi Chuck, I tried for a while, it's too complicated, on my own Facebook page. So anything that I put out there, and if my congregants are friends of mine, Facebook friends, they're going to see what I post. And sometimes there are things that would be, construed as political. Anyone here is a Facebook friend of mine today. You saw me doing Facebook Live, the gathering, an interfaith coalition of priests, imams, rabbis, other faith leaders who were trying to have a meeting with Representative Steve Knight of the 25th District up in Santa Clarita. And this is someone who has been very antagonistic towards the issue of dreamers. And immigrant justice, for me personally, I'm a national co-chair with the Union for Reform Judaism's advocacy body, trying to bring attention and awareness from a faith-based position of the need for our elected officials to come to create legislation for a Clean Dream Act. I was up there living my values at this particular place. I know that what I say here, some people are like, "Yo, Rabbi, go preach," and others are like, "Why is a rabbi talking about this? Why is a rabbi wasting his time up there instead of being in the office?" I was with members of my congregation. I was doing God's work with members of my community today. When I'm off the bema, off the pulpit, I'm a little, I don't know if I want to call it more political, but I feel I can definitely talk a little more freely because usually those are people who are either asking me direct questions and we're having a conversation, or with our justice work, we have folks who have opted into the work that we're doing. If I'm preaching from the pulpit, basically just like right now, I'm holding you hostage. I mean, you can get up and leave if you like, you're free to do that, but for the most part, people are not going to leave unless someone says something really, really, outrageous. I had a few years ago, I was in one small part. It was actually a very proud moment of mine, actually. One small part of my Rosh Hashanah sermon, the High Holy Days. I mentioned sort of in a whole series of things, talking about the need to create, to help increase gun safety and reduce episodes of gun violence. And the person who was in the congregation, who at that point was a former member of my congregation, I said, once I said the word gun safety, she got up and she walked out and huffed out. And I admonished her. I said, you're not even going to listen to what I have to say. I mean, at that point, I was talking about a particular issue from the pulpit, but not in a political way. I was looking at the values behind it, at the respect for life, at the idea that everyone is created b'tselem Elohim in the image of God, and that we love our neighbor as ourselves, and we do not stand idly by while our neighbor bleeds. I mean, it's like the top 10 of the great justice texts of our tradition that help to guide me in the work that I do when I preach about issues and values, both publicly from the pulpit and in private conversations with members of my congregation.
So just to clarify, your starting point is not your politics.
Correct.
Your starting point is your theology. Your starting point is your belief about who God is, what God does in this world. Your starting point is your faith, and you live that out in the way you've chosen to live that out. But your starting point is not with the goal of converting somebody to progressive democratism. Your goal is to live your faith.
Correct. That's what we do.
Yeah. It sounds like I need to get a Facebook page. Paula, do you have one?
I do.
Wow, I really need to get one now. But on a more serious note, I haven't had the pleasure or the opportunity to hear either of you preach a sermon. Maybe one of these days it would be a great thing to do. But what I love the hat analogy, John, and what I would say, Bob, to kind of go back to your initial question is, I would think that most of the time what we say is probably pretty consistent in different settings. And hopefully it is, because what we're saying is coming from, as a religious leader, especially when we're preaching to our congregation, hopefully that's very consistent with doctrine and principles and values. And as we take that hat off and go home and put the hat of husband or wife or whatever it might be, father, hopefully, I know for me, what I say there is hopefully very consistent. Now, how I say it might be very different if I'm hanging out with my teenagers, right? But hopefully that consistent thread is probably, hopefully there, and I would assume that is. And I would say hopefully a religious leader is not talking out of two sides of the mouth there, but there's some consistency along those lines, I think.
Well, and going back to what you said, to me, it's one of the problems of the age is the single interest voter, or the single interest, the passionate one about one issue. I experienced that. It caught me quite by surprise. The first Dawn program this year was Interfaith Relations in Los Angeles, and we had a wonderful panel. We had people who were citywide spokesmen for their religions, and we had newspaper coverage of it because it was so good. And after, when I was a nice warm feeling that we could put this together, and there was one person there who was the first time she had been to Dawn, and I said, well, what did you think? And she said, there were no women on the panel. I mean, I don't know how you deal with something like that.
You put more women on the panel. No, I just said this to, thank you for bringing this up. I didn't tell you this, I'm going to say a public story. I almost protested tonight. Reverend Paula is the only woman the entire year on our panel. There are some extraordinary women leaders in our community. And quite frankly, I think that I understand, because we have a lot of our participating congregations and there are more male clergy, on the peninsula around here. But if we want to really be true to ourselves, we have to represent our community. And in this age, one of the things that I have been made more aware of, I was reading, especially a number of months ago when the beginning of the Me Too movement, when a lot of my women colleagues were sharing horror stories of the amount of discrimination, harassment they're facing as women rabbis in their congregations. One of the questions that many of the men were asking is like, how can we do a better job? And one of the things that they said specifically was, when you're inviting people to speak to you at your congregation, if most of the time if they're hearing from you, the male rabbi, bring in more women teachers, bring in more women scholars, and I think that's really one way that we could do this. So, I don't mean to, I think that there was some truth in what that person said, because there are, yes, the panel that you had, some extraordinary leaders and who also represent those particular, faith communities, and I imagine it might be harder to find a woman representing the Catholic diocese. I recognize that, and sometimes it is,
and the Muslim.
Yeah, but that said,
this was on this particular time. It was inappropriate.
Right,
but I recognize the validity. We do have one lady clergy who took this year off. Didn't want to be on panel.
Which is fine. But I'm saying, but sometimes there's you know better, Bob, in terms of how everything gets put together, but there's also the perception. So I would personally love to see, and I'm happy to share some names of some other women rabbis in our community who maybe don't live right here on the hill or whatever, but who could certainly represent us just as well as, at least from the Jewish faith, as well as I can.
But we've by and large been a community-based group, with the exception of academics that we bring in to teach us a bit more, and that's been the normal way of doing. But anyway, let me, while we're still on the bigger picture here, do you consider yourselves to be community leaders in addition to leaders of your congregation? How do you view your role in the community, the Palos Verdes community, the South Bay community? Don't go too far with it, but how do you view your role there? Is it complemented by your role within your congregation? Is it separate? Do you feel a need to be on that stage? Hello?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. Inasmuch as our congregations and the members of our congregations are part of the community, and I think as leaders we serve them, I think that indirectly we have some responsibility in that regard. Just sitting here on this panel here, I feel a sense of camaraderie, a sense of togetherness just with this group here, and from that sense as well, I think that that makes me feel like I'm somewhat part of the community and have some role to support community initiatives. So I think the answer to that question, at least for me, Bob, is yes.
In the Episcopal Church, we have something called deaneries, where maybe 12 parishes are a part of a deanery. In our diocese, we have 10 deaneries. And I'm the dean of our deanery, Deanery 8. And 4 or 5 times a year, I bring the clergy together from my deanery for us to gather. And sometimes we bring in someone who is on the city council or involved in the community, so they know what the faith-based group is trying to do within their congregations, and to make them more aware that we're here and we're available. But other than that, I don't really have the time, and I'm sorry that I don't go to meetings for city council. I try to just do what I can back at the ranch in my parish. But I'm aware and promote, make parishioners aware of what's out there.
John?
I think for me, my mind was stuck trying to figure out what it means to be a community leader, what that sort of looks like. And I know in a variety of circles, community leader, of course, means that you're a member of the Chamber of Commerce, or you're a member of the Rotary Club. This is what it means to be a community leader, or you attend council meetings. I would say that you two and the work you've done on gun violence is an incredibly important community leadership initiative. I know there's been a handful of clergy who have been working quite closely with some of the workers at the Terranea Resort with some of the workers' disputes that are happening over there. While that isn't directly connected to any congregation, it's certainly community leadership and flows from faith and flows from their gospel understanding. But many of those things may touch on traditional congregational leadership very tangentially, unless we happen to bring some of our parishioners with us into that. So maybe I'll throw it back to you, Bob. I'll interview you.
Well,
say more about
I'm going to throw it back to you because you live in Pasadena.
I do.
That automatically makes it difficult to be a community leader in the South Bay, I think, doesn't it?
Well,
No?
it completely depends.
You don't live here. You're not
that's-
spending your nights.
Well, and there you go. And for a number of people, that is true, because I do not pay property taxes here. I have no voice. That's a fairly true statement. I can't petition the state senator from down in this area. I don't have much voice if I go to the city council as, the mercenary coming in from Pasadena. And so I tend to look at a much wider picture of Los Angeles than I tend to do with Rancho Palos Verdes. So I think it gives me a great possibility of seeing, every day I get to scan the full scope of Los Angeles from Pasadena all the way through downtown, all the way down the 110, all the way through San Pedro. Long Beach is just right over. I have the full scan of, I'm the fortunate one that I have my commute. I will not say that mid-commute driving through downtown.
Good for you. All right, let's get down to the level of the congregation and the duties within the congregation a bit more. Mike, you have a unique, as far as this panel is concerned, situation because you're not a paid professional clergy. You are a volunteer. You are assisted by volunteers, and the Latter-day Saints Church runs on volunteers, and bless them all. They do wonderful work. It's quite admirable. But describe your functioning organization, what you do. You have counselors, bishops, and people who do things. They're all volunteers. How does it work?
Okay, that's a good question. Let me start kind of at the congregational level. So we have congregations, and here in the South Bay area we have about 7. And each of those congregations has anywhere between 400 to 600 members in each congregation. And each congregation, the leadership, they have a bishop, and a bishop has 2 counselors that are the leadership of those congregations. And as Bob said, they all have full-time jobs. I have a full-time job, and we try to do as much church work and take care of our families and everything else and squeeze it all in. Our church is a little unique in that everyone in our congregation is asked to have an assignment, whether that's a Sunday school teacher or a youth group teacher or whatever it might be. And so we all kind of pitch in and share the load along the lines. Interestingly, as we were talking about speaking on Sundays, the one unique thing is the members of our congregation, male and female, give talks or preach on Sunday. certain topics. And so certainly the bishop of the congregation will do that from time to time, but most times members of the congregation are assigned a topic to talk about, whether it's faith or overcoming challenges or how to study the scriptures or whatever it might be, and they'll prepare a 10 to 15 minute talk or sermon and give that. The next level of organization above a congregation or a ward is called a stake, and it's kind of maybe like a diocese or maybe like your deanery, okay? And I have responsibility of that broader or larger organization called a stake, and so I work with those 7 bishops in those 7 congregations. We try to keep things going, and we cover everything from worship on Sunday to budgets to buildings to everything that comes with running a church. And so that is kind of a simple explanation, but that's kind of how we function and operate. Is that kind of what you're looking for, Bob?
Yeah, it is. You also have the responsibility, which I'd like for you to explain as much as you can, of certifying who is eligible to go to the temples. There's work required and standards above the local level that are necessary for admission to a temple.
Correct. So we're in a church building, a church house, and we have a chapel where we worship every Sunday. But in our church, we have what are called temples. There's the Los Angeles Temple is located up on Santa Monica Boulevard. There's just one in Los Angeles. There's one in Newport Beach and one in San Diego and one out in Redlands. That's kind of the Southern California area. But temples. They are not used for Sunday worship, but they're used to perform other ordinances. Marriages are performed in temples. And as Bob mentioned, members that are considered to be in good standing or have the ample amount of faith and are ready for that temple experience receive a recommendation to go to the temple. And as leaders of the church, we have the opportunity to meet with people and discuss what happens in the temple and make sure that they're ready to go to the temple and be able to be blessed by having a positive experience there. And so we meet with members to do that. We meet with, we'll have a funeral in this building. Unfortunately, a member of our congregation passed away. We do funerals. We meet with youth. We minister to people. We do administering type work, help people in temporal ways, help people in spiritual ways. And this is certainly what we all do. We all know those words well. But that's kind of how we're organized and what we do. So.
In seminaries, do they teach management, how to handle a congregation, deal with staff, deal with budgets, things like that? Are these things taught in seminary?
You're asking that with a smirk as though you know the answer. For myself, we had we had the possibility of taking a half course that was an elective on finances. That's it. That's the end. Everything else you're supposed to have picked up in your internship, which for us Lutherans is a year long. We go to seminary, we do our internship, and then we go back for another year of school. Or there's just sort of the understanding that you'll figure it out. Previous pastors have figured it out and survived, so you too shall figure this thing out. The majority of time in seminary is spent on theology, on practical ministry, which is things like pastoral care and worship classes, and then Bible classes, and that's
teaching the faith.
It's teaching the faith, yeah, but very little on actual organizational management. I speak as a Lutheran. I don't know if this is the case for others as well.
Episcopalian's got the mic ready to go here.
I had a class in seminary called Church Administration and Finance. And different clergy were brought in to give us units on certain areas, including conflict resolution. And we had books to read and discuss. One of the books was Clergy Wellness, but the classic was a book entitled When the Sheep Attack. That in any congregation there will be people that will just go at you, go at you, go at you. That's when the sheep are attacking.
Did you feel prepared based on that one class? Based on that one class, did you feel like that was a good preparation? Was that enough? Did you sort of long for more, knowing what you know now after being in the parish?
It is absolutely amazing. No. You know, in seminary, you're in a world that, and I was in seminary for 4 years. The last year was field education, but in seminary, you're trying to get through the reading, you're trying to get your papers done. I would love to go through seminary now, because I would know what I want to remember. And, but once I was ordained, then I was in a group called Fresh Start with other priests who were just ordained. We were in that group for 2 years, once a month, just to talk about what we were going through. And all of a sudden, by doing that, we began to integrate and get some confidence, learn to balance better. It's been 8 years since I was ordained a priest. I'm just beginning to get the hang of it.
What do they teach in Reform School, Chuck?
Reform school? Reform school? Come on, Bob. Well, first, I got to say that I would imagine that in the LDS Church, it's probably going to be one of the few times that the president of the stake might have actually been a CEO or a senior level manager someplace else. So I would imagine that that this church is probably best suited for those who have executive management skill, especially if the leaders come from that field. I'm not sure what your profession is and how you have time to do both. And that's been my greatest source of admiration for the LDS Church, is that spirit of volunteerism and how it sustains itself. I kind of joked to John, like, the difference between you work probably as hard, if not harder than us, except we get a paycheck for it, and that's all we have to do. So at the Hebrew Union College, I think I was very fortunate because I went for my first 2 years of seminary. I studied at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the Reform Rabbinic Seminary here on the Los Angeles campus, and there, had a different name then. Today it's called the Zellico School of Nonprofit Management. And there are actually courses that I was able to take as electives to develop just a little bit. So I voluntarily took a course in fundraising, which served me well. I took a course in synagogue management, which at least gave me some basic ideas of things to bring up to my congregation, especially early on when I realized that when I came to Temple Bethel, there were certain things that were missing. But one of the things that I've noticed, and right now, if I were going back to seminary again, I might very well get the secondary degree in nonprofit management that would better suit me to be not only the spiritual leader, to be able to preach and pastor and teach and all the other things that I do, but also be a better manager and administrator. I would say for most of my colleagues, when we talk about the things that are toughest for us, or maybe our Achilles heel and our rabbinates, it probably is some of the management pieces. It's tough. It's also tough when you are someone's rabbi and also have to be the quasi-supervisor because that person's a volunteer. Has anyone ever tried to fire a volunteer before? It's really hard to do, if not impossible, especially if the week before you were sitting at that person's mother's bedside as that person's mother was dying, and yet that person, so these intersecting relationships are there as well. What I'm very grateful for is that in my movement, as a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, there's been a tremendous increase in opportunities for professional growth and development, access to professional coaches, access to courses that teach about fundraising management, et cetera. Not to mention there's some extraordinary interfaith organizations, such as, well, the Alban Institute of Blessed Memory, which created a series of wonderful books and courses. I think the group has now been kind of subsumed by another organization. There are, I know that at the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern University, there is an executive certificate course in management that a lot of my colleagues have taken. The Lake Institute provides courses in religious philanthropy. So there are, and a lot of my colleagues are working on getting executive masters in business or in administration or nonprofit management, because we recognize that the days of just showing up on Friday night or Saturday morning and, giving a good sermon and being at someone's bedside, that is central and important parts of our rabbinates, of our pastorates, but there's also so much more that we have to do. And luckily today, I think that the next generation of rabbis, and I hope also other ministers coming out, have, either the courses are in their seminaries or they have access to the courses they can take outside of the seminary once they're working.
But as I've heard us talking, it seems that all of them are electives. Yeah. So I could absolutely go do my 4 years of seminary and then go get a 2-year MBA if I wanted to, but ultimately that's on us, sort of in addition. So I would say, at least for myself, like you said, Paula, I would love to go back now, knowing what I know now and knowing what I could have grabbed a hold of. But when one is in seminary, there are just so many questions that you don't even know you have. And so knowing, boy, I should probably take an elective in fundraising. Why? I'm going to be a pastor. It just doesn't cross my mind. So I'm imagining seminaries sort of cross most of our systems are going through a variety of different turmoils, and this is certainly one of them. So,
all right, let me ask particularly these three. I don't mean to leave you out, but you have lay leadership within your congregation, and somehow you need to reach accommodations, or this is what I do, this is what you do, this is what we do together. How does that work? I mean, it's an individual congregation kind of thing, I'm sure. But tell me how you got there, or how you do it now. Where do you get involved as a congregation leader when it's an administrative affair, an issue, and not a religious issue?
When I first went to St. Francis, right from the start, I wanted to promote lay leadership, because we are in this together. We all have been given gifts. We're all called to serve. Hopefully, I can help raise awareness that we're all called to serve. So at St. Francis, we now have something called a ministry council. It's all lay leaders that are on the council, and some of the areas that they lead are outreach, social justice, fellowship, gosh, I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, there's about 6 areas. And that's one of the most exciting things that I do, is try to empower the gifts in other people, help them come alive to who they are in God and the gifts that they have been given, and let them lead. I am not a micromanager. I empower, I let go, and together we're in it.
Things like budgets that have to be put together with both lay and religious leadership, and some balance between the two. How do you do that? How does that work?
There are members of our finance committee who are far more expert on matters of budget and finance than I am. But I'm much more expert in Jewish values and morality than they are when it comes to expressing our values through our budget. Now, your budget should be a sacred document, and your budget should be able to reveal your values. And you should be able to look at a budget and say, okay, what are the important priorities of this organization? So that when, if we are not going to be providing raises for our teachers or for our custodians, hypothetically, if we're not going to be doing that, what does that say about who we are? If the senior clergy is going to be getting a big old raise and everyone else is going to be getting pay cuts, what does that say about the organization? If anytime you want to put money into education or justice work and they say, well, no, we have to put more into recarpeting the office or whatever. I mean, there are lots of ways of looking at it. For me, my voice, I hope, and my lay leaders here who have been on those meetings with me can hopefully attest that I hope that I've raised the voice, whether it's been listened to or not. At least I've amplified the voice to say, have you thought about the implications of this decision? What does it say when we are cutting money out of our very small social justice line because we want to put it someplace else? Hard decisions are made. I always tell my leadership, I'm really good at spending your money. And I like doing that because I like spending the money of our synagogue to help promote the vision and values of Temple Bethel, both within our congregation and outside of as well. I also recognize that with that pledge to spend the money, it's also my responsibility to help raise the money so that we can spend it as well.
There are problems galore in the religious world these days of shrinking budgets. And loss of reduction in revenue and having to deal with some hard choices on how to manage this. This again is real life, and it can happen. Go talk to some budget issues, Paula. Now that you talk to everything else, the work of the congregation. Let's get into budgeting, finances, and pure administration. How is that managed?
Not easy. We have a finance committee that meets once a month. I'm, of course, a member of that, a member of our endowment committee, a member of our investment committee. On each of those committees are lay leaders who are experts in that field. And I begin each meeting with prayer, and I always chime in with issues that you've brought up, Chuck. Wait a minute, how does this fit into our mission and our ministry? And when I first began to become a part of a finance, endowment, or investment committee, I said, okay, what kind of voice will I have in this committee besides hearing numbers? So I tried to present a moral message and our mission.
Now, Mike, you're used to working with budgets. You do this professionally at Honda, and I'm sure you have finance committee of some kind that has experience with finance, but it's not the same as with clergy versus lay. I'm not sure how to ask the question, but it seems to be I would think more collegial.
Yeah, so we deal with many of the same things other than individual salaries, but we have expenses for lights and building and everything else to run a church. The one thing that's a little different from us is ours is kind of handled from the total church perspective, and we are allocated a certain amount of money based off of the size of our congregation, and then we operate within that financial allocation. So that's kind of a simple way to explain it, but we have certainly all of the same, how are we going to take that amount of money and fund it, which organization, how much are the youth going to get, and how much is this organization going to get, and we want to do this year, okay, let's allocate this here. And so we go through that, that same process, and we have a financial committee or an audit organization that monitors that and makes sure that funds are appropriated the right way, and we have budgets, and so all the same, just a little bit different structure.
Well, I assume the same authority that tells you how much you can spend tells you how much you need to give to that organization, to the central, in fundraising or contributions to the higher organization.
Yeah.
They give you a number, or is it based on individuals?
Yeah, so within our church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a tithe, which is defined as 10% of income. And so everyone is expected to pay that tithe. And fortunately, that covers, and that does not go to the local congregation, that goes to the greater church body. And from that money that is tithed comes the money to operate the local church. And so fortunately, we are able to function in that manner. We do for special youth type trips or activities for our Boy Scouts, a high adventure to Catalina in the summer, a week trip. We'll do some fundraising activities to generate some additional funds for our scouts to do some of those types of things, or our young women to take a similar type trip. So we'll do some fundraising along those lines.
Now, I assume you at the stake or at the ward level, you oversee the collection of the tithes?
Yes, we oversee the collection of the tithes, and yes, so both the incoming and the incoming from the congregation as far as tithes, and we get that to where it needs to go, and then we receive the allocation coming back from that as well. Yes.
I'd love to see your budget sometime without the need for professional staff salaries.
I mean, I guess, this is what we could all learn from. If you think of, you have an organization in which their members are expected to contribute 10% of their income, and they are not paying professional salary overhead. I mean, it's amazing what you can probably do with those. I mean, in all seriousness, with those extra funds to be able to put them really towards mission, towards. I'm assuming those funds are help send the young men and women on mission throughout the world, and to the great work with the relief work that the LDS Church does. So it's an extraordinary model, which I think is unique to this church.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yep, those funds help support a lot of those things as well. Yes, you're correct.
Having been invited to 2 temples before they were consecrated, there's a lot of money in building. They're beautiful facilities.
Yeah, the money for those come from that tithing money as well. So, yes.
I've been to Redlands and Newport Beach before they were, when I could go. when it was okay.
We'll invite you to the next one as well.
Okay. We've got time for a couple quick questions. Let me get down here. Questions? In the back.
Today on the radio, they were talking about the problem, or how to do the gun, the tragic things, and where should it start. And the gentleman on there was talking about the fact that we need to have these schools and the families and the police and everybody else more preventative than after the fact, and that no matter how much you put into a school for security, it's not going to really work because many times it's the person who's already in the school. So I think that when you talk about needing to work together as a community to talk about this, I think you need to get people to do some actions, such as recognizing when kids have real problems, and I hope that's part of the thing that you're doing also.
One of the more powerful articles that I saw after Parkland said that one of the ways to combat some of these behaviors is to pay attention, because so often these young people, by and large, these young men, by and large, who are committing these heinous acts, especially in the schools, and whether it's a school shooting in Parkland of 17 fatalities or the dozens of others that are happening, because when it's I hate to say it, when it's only 2 or 3 people who are shot and maybe only 1 killed, that doesn't make the news. But a lot of times what this article was saying is that if we recognize the loneliness and the social isolation, and teachers are able to recognize that, and they're able to create friends and kind of normal kind of social encounters or experiences that might, I mean, who knows, but it might, if you're able to take one very lonely person and help make him less lonely, maybe that's one way that we reduce one tragedy.
So I want to say thank you to all of you, because this has been one of the most inspirational nights we've spent together as a family out. Sure beats the movies. And my question is actually very targeted, but it requires me to explain it, and I'll try to do it as briefly as I can, so bear with me. There's been a lot of conversation and discussion about very specific and flammable or perhaps provocative topics tonight. And we have a duty that you as clergy and members and leaders in our community are describing that does not fall all on your shoulders. And we are all seeing this in our neighborhoods and in our communities and on media, that the younger generations, and it is growing, have a more outward view of what is happening rather than an inward view of how they should perhaps respond. And at least this is my observation. And because of that, we are very interested in our, sorry, President Gazdik, our Facebook pages, our Instagram feeds, our Twitter handles, our memes, our texting, and our telephones, and our TV, and all these things. And we're not focused or rooted in those things that help us respond when these horrible things happen. Okay, are we asking the wrong question? Should we be focusing on how to support our families first and not focus on the things that are outside? Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you.
The answer over there, who's?
Go ahead, Bob.
Do you want to?
Go ahead. Inward versus outward?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if you heard the very start, but I think I shared some comments along those lines of focusing inward. The family is the basic unit of society, and I think if we can strengthen that, we go a long ways in helping out in some of these societal challenges that we currently face. So I would agree with that.
We live in a world, we live in a Facebook, we live in a social media world, so the question is can we as parents, what can we do to show that the family time together, that time around the dinner table should be sacrosanct, that we should put our phones away. Every single night in my home, it is an ongoing battle with my 14-year-old son. Put the darn phone down, and and it's a hard thing. I know a lot of folks deal with this, but sometimes, if you just kind of just encourage, put it away, or just figure out just how to have more of that family time together. I think that will strengthen and enable us to look a little bit more inward as we recognize that so many are looking outward as well. But thank you for the question and for the comment.
Just one, actually two quick things. One of them, I don't know, Bob, if you've touched on social media as one of the conversations for this group, but a pretty fascinating and ubiquitous thing that all of us are encountering and might be worth the conversation. But then I would also just want to lift this up that for me as a single man with no wife and no kids, the language of family is certainly in my mind when I think of, my parents who live 7 states away, and I think of my grandparents and my sister and her husband and children, but just the number of those of us who don't have what we imagine to be family, that we don't have the wife or the husband and the 2.2 kids, but that we can imagine family in multiple ways. And so that, for me, I'm allowed to imagine family in a much broader definition. So I can look at my congregation as my family. I can look at my neighborhood as a family that is incredibly dear to me, that I want to care for in the same way that, God willing, I would care for, my kid. So.
While I was listening to your discussion tonight, and you talk about what you do from the pulpit in addressing issues that we all face today, but I was very interested, or am very interested, in knowing what you think clergy could or should be doing beyond your members. And Reverend John, if you don't mind me using your first name, you mentioned being active and going to rallies, or to, you used a different term, but I'm wondering if clergy should be doing more of that. Because it's not just our members, your members, who need to be alerted to what's going on, but our politicians and other people doing mass voices, I think, address that. Thank you.
In the Episcopal diocese, we have something called the resistance movement, and that is very clergy-based and always on Facebook and wherever they are publicly protesting or waving a sign. For the Women's March, there were all kinds of Episcopal clergy of all denominations, all of us wearing collars. Clergy are very involved. They're not usually on the news. You can see them on Facebook.
So I would put it this way. In Lutheran theology, Luther, as he was writing, referred to sin as our propensity, and not even our propensity, our very being, as curvatus in se. That being sinful is our very being, curvatus in se, being curved in on ourselves, of staring at our belly button, of having a C-shaped backbone that all we're really looking at is ourselves. Sin. I would make the argument that organizations, churches, can be just as complicit and guilty of that inward curved sin. So congregations that don't sort of continually straighten out the backbone so that they can look outside of their windows, outside of their doors, we're all caught in the same trap that we're all caught in. So.
I mentioned earlier when Bob asked about those we look up to, I mentioned Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. For those who don't know much about him, he was one of the most preeminent theologians of the 20th century. And he was the one who just wrote this beautiful book about the Sabbath, about taking time out from your week, that we live in this time, 6 days we live in the world of commerce and things and space, and on Shabbat we need to move into a cathedral of time. One of the deepest spiritual thinkers you will ever encounter. Yet, he was also one of the most, he was a fierce activist for social justice. If you look at those pictures of Dr. Martin Luther King marching in Selma, you see you see this short bearded Jewish white man who is walking alongside them. That was Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who famously said after that experience, it felt as if my feet were praying. And I think that so often as clergy, both in our congregations and outside, we spend our time time ministering to our congregations, preaching the word on Friday night, Shabbat morning, Sunday, dealing with the issues of budget and finance and pastoral care. But we also, I feel, have this responsibility to be out in the community and engaged, raising our voices when we see injustice, speaking truth to power, and being that moral religious voice when sometimes it is absent. And for me, to this day, I think for many rabbis, even of my generation, Heschel is that model to whom we look today.
Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the panel. May 8th at St. John Fisher, we will be talking about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, which is one of the more interesting parts of the Bible. So please join us, and I'm sorry for those with questions I didn't get to, but we do have a time limit. And thank you all. It's time for Interfaith Cookies.